Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Kalamata, Greece on August 25th, 2025. 10 months ago, I traveled to Cyprus to investigate reports that Israelis were pouring into the small island nation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Our report, which was titled Israelis Flooding into Cyprus to Buy Anything in Sight, has been one of our most widely watched videos. At the time of our report, Israeli, Cypriot, and Greek media were all saying that Cyprus was experiencing a large influx of Israelis. Many of them were not in Cyprus purely for entertainment purposes. They were reportedly purchasing businesses and residential properties and establishing a significant permanent presence on the island. Well, based on more recent reports, it appears that the flood of Israelis into Cyprus might have turned into a deluge. In June, Stefanos Stefanou, the leader of the Cypriot AKEL party, generated controversy when he warned of the Israeli influx into the island and the threat of Zionist expansionism. AKEL is a left-wing political party and the second largest political party in Cyprus. The largest political party in Cyprus, the governing right-wing Democratic Rally, is strongly pro-Israel. Predictably, Stefanou's warning about Israeli expansionism ignited charges of antisemitism. Israel's ambassador to Cyprus, Oren Anolik, accused Stefanou of, quote, plain and simple antisemitism. Stefanou did not back down, however. He vigorously denied the charge of antisemitism and stated that, quote, Israel tolerates no criticism and wants to control everything, close quote. Now here to discuss this with us is Elina Xenophontos. Elina is a geopolitical analyst and international law and globalization specialist, and she joins us today from Cyprus. Thank you very much for joining us today, Elina.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. It's a pleasure to be on today.
So why don't we begin by talking, Elina, about the actual extent of the Israeli presence in Cyprus? What do we know about the number of Israelis who've taken up residence in the island nation? And where are they concentrated and what kind of business activities do they tend to focus upon?
Right. So it's quite actually a complex question because on the one hand, there aren't actually accurate numbers, particularly in the south, as to how many Israelis have influxed onto the island, because they pretty much stopped counting after October of 2023. Up until November, we had some records of at least 10,000 Israelis that had entered the island following October 7th. But from that point onwards, the numbers have been obscured purposefully, obviously, so that there doesn't create sort of this mass hysteria among the Cypriot population, who up to a certain degree is very aware of what is happening. So that's the one aspect. However, the other aspect is that there isn't just an influx even just on the south, which is, very apparent, and they're purchasing mass properties. And they're usually, to answer actually a part of your question, they tend to also focus on real estate as well. So they're purchasing mass areas within different parts, particularly I would say of Larnaca and Limassol, and they're sort of expanding these territories. And for one, to provide just one classic example, in the area of Larnaca, for instance, where they've also established some of Jewish-only schools and Jewish-only cafes. They've also began in the center of Larnaca, in what we call the Old City. They've significantly started buying out a lot of the shops within the area. And what that's actually done, and because it's kind of creating now an exclusive particular zone that is under protection, because allegedly, obviously, they need to be under a degree of protection fundamentally in order to prevent any sort of supposed attacks on them. This is causing problems for the local Cypriot shop owners, who are now no longer able to the consumers can no longer have access to the shops because these areas have become secluded for basically the protection of the Jewish community here. So even Cypriot shop owners are now selling their shops. So they're mostly focusing on buying shops, real estate to establish homes, buildings, schools, and pretty much establishing major communities. And what's also happening, however, is that there has been an influx of Israelis that predates even October 2023, going all the way back to 2021, even in the occupied territories in the north. And according to reports that were coming out of media from the occupied territories in the north, they had actually purchased around 20,000 acres of land. Now, this was back in 2021. I haven't seen any updates from that point onwards to see, at least I haven't, if that has escalated since. But 20,000 acres of land on territory that is disputed fundamentally, obviously, because we're talking about occupied territory that belongs to, refugees from Cypriots in the south, etc. And the same thing can be said for even some of the purchases that are happening here in the south as well. So there's an influx that is happening both within the occupied territories in the north and in the south. And if we even go back to some of the reports that came out of the northern territory of Cyprus, or the occupied territory of Cyprus, at the time they were saying that they were trying to establish Zionist settlements or exclusive Zionist territories in the north of Cyprus, which alarmed obviously the Turkish-speaking Cypriot population, who were obviously feeling threatened by the existence of such mass territories that have been bought out by Israel, and apparently also pouring money into investments of real estate as well in the north as well as in the south. So what we're seeing is this gradual encroachment from both sides, whether it's in the northern or the southern Republic of Cyprus, by Israel. And actually, I would even like to add at this point that this isn't even something that's particularly new, because if we were to go back to the 2000s, the University of Tel Aviv and Haifa University had actually published multiple sort of theses, reports, if you like. And there's actually one specifically from the University of Tel Aviv titled Cyprus is the springboard to the Aliyah, and why essentially Cyprus should not be abandoned by Israel or as part of their Zionist sort of project, because it's essential in order to contain and control West Asia and to contain the surveillancing of the region in order to maintain their colonialist presence within the region. And so this was an article. This was actually a thesis that was published in 2007. So this has been very much part and parcel of their plans for a very long period of time, even going back to the era of Theodor Herzl himself.
I actually wanted to ask you about that, but just before I do you believe that the sentiments expressed by the AKEL leader, Stefanos Stefanou, are widely shared among the Cypriot people? And in particular, do we have any polling data about this?
So the polling data that we do have, from what I've seen up until this point, is mostly related as to how the Cypriot population feels with regards to the president's support of Israel and his stance on supporting the Palestinian issue. And I think it was, around 82%. It was within the 80 percentile range. Found that they were dissatisfied with the way that the president was dealing with the Palestinian issue and his support for Israel. So in that aspect, we've seen that Cypriots are highly dissatisfied, and there is a sense of solidarity with the Palestinian people, and this dissatisfaction as to how the president is going about his relations with Israel. However, the polls that we've seen haven't obviously exclusively put into question how Cypriots feel about the influx of Israelis, at least from what I have seen. So I haven't seen a direct questionnaire in that sense, but I think that's also rather purposeful. With regards to, this is going to be more anecdotal. From what I have seen, it's the sentiments that Cypriots have with regards to Israelis on the island is somewhat divided based, unfortunately, on the political affiliations that the vast majority of Cypriots have. So if you, for example, are somebody that is that belongs to the left and will most likely, for example, be a party supporter of the AKEL party, which Stefanos Stefanou is the leader of, the leftists in Cyprus are far more conscious of what is happening. And based on the kind of engagements that I see and interact with, people are very wary of the influx of Israelis on the island. Those that belong more to the center right or the liberal center right, that of the DC sort of party which is in power at the moment, they tend to have a bit more of a neutral stance or believe that this threat is more of a leftist delusion rather than a reality. But then on the other side, there is also the far right who has an overall issue with immigration as well, that is also becoming very wary of the influx of not just Israelis, but the overall what they feel is a takeover of their country. So I would say it just depends on the kind of political affiliation and the sort of ideology that each Cypriot has. But an actual definitive poll, unfortunately, has not been, from what I've seen, again, put out there. And I think this is deliberate because there is an attempt, even within Cypriot media, to placate what is actually happening on the island. And this has to do not just with the Israeli influx, but also the Raf Agrotiri, how that's being used, and Cyprus' general position within the region.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Theodor Herzl, one of the founders of Zionism. When I was preparing to do our report last year on the influx of Israelis into the island, I learned for the very first time, I had no idea up until then, that the early Zionists had quite significant designs on the island of Cyprus. And what I learned actually came from current reporting in the Israeli media. They were talking openly about the importance of Cyprus in the expansionist vision of the early Zionists. Could you tell us more about that? How did they view Cyprus, and what attempts did they make to colonize the island in the early days of Zionism?
So, following the British sort of takeover of the island, there were 3 attempts by the early Zionists between pretty much the 1890s to 19 pretty much 30s to take over Cyprus. Now, the idea was the early Zionists, they were concerned that even the area of Palestine on its own would not be sufficient in size for the Zionist colonialist state. They wanted a far larger territory. And initially, they had something what was called the Greater Palestine idea. And what that was meant to include was the area of, course, Palestine, but also Lebanon, Jordan, parts of Syria, Egypt, but also Rhodes Island in Greece, and then Cyprus. This was pretty much the idea of the Greater Palestine that they called at the time that they wanted in order to secure this territory, because it was fundamental for them to have access to different water supplies, water ports, but also mountainous areas for surveillance. It's part and parcel of the Zionist agenda for control. And we're also seeing that in the way now that they're occupying different territories in Syria, which are crucial. They're now currently occupying 40% of Syria's water reserves. They're also occupying Mount Hermon, which is significant in terms of surveillance in the area and therefore keeping control over their colonial entity and all the surrounding territories. We're seeing the same thing in even in Lebanon, and I think it was Ben Gurion that had even said that the occupation of the Litani River was an absolute must for the Zionist entity, because again, it has to do with the control of water resources in order to be able to control territory, to suppress and exploit their neighbors, and then obviously be able to assert themselves as a colonialist entity. So Cyprus fell within that scope of requiring the island very much for its location, its positioning, which historically has always been one of the main sort of attractions for multiple different colonial empires. Cyprus's location has been that, and we're seeing the reasons for that now. And so the plan was there was multiple letters and exchanges between British sort of the administrative rulers of Cyprus and the Zionists, and they tried to purchase Cyprus from Britain financially. And one of the plans actually was to actually forcefully expel. So when we talk about the ethnic cleansing of the Cypriot Christian population of the island, or the Greek-speaking population of the island. And the idea was to ship them off to Thessalonica and basically only leave the minority Muslim population, because they were smaller in numbers, and then relocate a vast majority of Jews, particularly from Europe, over into Cyprus. And this was pretty much something that was discussed repeatedly from the 1890s, and again up until, like I said, the 1930s, and even up until the point that when the Arab revolutions began, the Palestinian revolutions began, and it was during also World War II, or right before World War II, when a lot of Jews were brought over to Cyprus. I think around 50,000 Jews were brought over to Cyprus, particularly during the start and after, or during the World War II. The idea was to even try to see how they would be able to assimilate into society. It was a bit of it's often presented as, oh, they just came here and they're just only meant to be here temporarily. Yes and no. The idea was to eventually always end up in Palestine, as that has always been the sort of the objective, but to also see to what extent Cyprus could be used in this context. However, because there was a lot of internal rebellion in Cyprus as well against the British Empire at the time, as well as obviously the same, we saw the same sort of liberation movements that were happening in Palestine at the time, the British were feeling unable to control what was essentially happening, all these mass revolts, because in Limassol, for instance, there was a lot of violence that began to inaugurate from the local Cypriot population against the Jews that were placed here. So that's when they eventually abandoned that. And also for other strategic reasons, the British decided to keep Cyprus as their own sort of colonial outpost. But this has been a long-standing, Cyprus being a critical component to the Zionist project. It's been something that has existed since the initial stages of Zionism and was in fact a territory that was considered as being part of what is called Israel today.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to show you a clip of a recent interview that the war criminal Netanyahu did with a so-called journalist who is a former right-wing member of the Israeli Knesset. Have a look at this.
מפת הארץ המובטחת.
וזה אני רואה כמשימה גדולה. מה זה?
זה הוויז'ן שלי, זה אחד הדברים שחלמתי עליהם, מפת הארץ המובטחת.
יפה.
הגיע הזמן, קוראים לזה ירושלם. אני לא נותן את זה לך, אני מעניק את זה לך כדי שתיתן את זה לרעתך שרה.
תודה רבה.
אתה מתחבר לחזון?
מאוד.
באמת?
מאוד.
לישראל השלמה.
אם אתה שואל אותי, אנחנו כאן, אתה יודע, הרבה פעמים מזכיר את אבא שלי. הדור של ההורים שלי היה צריך להקים את המדינה. והדור שלנו, הדור שלי, צריך להבטיח את המשך קיומה. וזה אני רואה כמשימה גדולה.
Okay, so just to break down what happened there, this interview happened on I-24 News in Israel a couple of weeks ago, and this character, this former Knesset member, hands to Netanyahu an amulet, which is in a box, and it's an amulet that is a representation of Greater Israel. And Netanyahu accepts the box, puts it down in front of him, but never opens it up. So we never actually see what Greater Israel is as depicted in the amulet. And the interviewer asks him, how do you feel about this vision of Greater Israel? He says, I'm absolutely committed to it. It's a great mission that goes all the way back to my parents' generation and so forth. So because he never actually takes the amulet out of the box, we don't really know how expansive his vision of Greater Israel is. But he is openly declaring his avid support for some notion of Greater Israel. Do you think that these kinds of statements by Netanyahu should concern the people of Cyprus? Because as you indicated, there are versions of Greater Israel which do encompass all or part of Cyprus. So is this a threat that you think they ought to take seriously?
I absolutely do. And this is where the media in Cyprus, who is unfortunately significantly compromised by the agenda as well as the EU, as well as obviously the ruling party on the island, is actively preventing the Cypriot population from having access to this information or asking these critical questions. Because not only are the Israelis currently sort of mass purchasing properties through real estate in both the north and the south, but just recently as well, for example, there was an article that was published by Israel Hayom. And in that article, it was basically saying why the Cyprus problem is an Israeli problem. I don't know if you were aware of that article, but it's a fascinating article to read, because it pretty much dictates that that because of the Turkish occupation of the north, and because allegedly Turkey's acting as a force that's belligerent to Israel, which to me is questionable in multiple different ways, given the way that we have seen Turkey in many ways actually aid the Zionist entity through trade, whether it's directly or indirectly, as we have come to see, due to the most recent, for example, disclosures. I think it was the Cradle that published also a report that showed that Turkey was actually trading with Israel, but now not directly through Israel, but saying that they were increasing their trade with the Palestinian occupied territories tenfold, which is controlled by Israel. And this essentially means that trade is going basically between Turkey into Israel through the occupied territories of Palestine. But regardless, they're using the occupation of the north to say that there is a fundamental need to secure Cyprus in order to preserve the national security interests of Israel. And what the article essentially argued is that even Hamas is planning to open headquarters in the north. It's concerning when you see Israel claiming that Hamas is doing something anywhere that is pretext for pretty much anything. That also Iran is now operating in the north, which is again a questionable sort of assertion to make, given the kind of a strange relationships between Turkey and Iran. But apparently Turkey is also enabling Iran in the north, and therefore the suggestion behind this article, again, this is Israeli Haram. This is one of the largest sort of media outlets within Israel. The article concludes that Israel will have to make Cyprus's problem its own by attempting to, quote, liberate Cyprus, which is ironic given the fact that they're occupying Palestine, ethnically cleansing the Palestinian people. But now the need to liberate an occupied peoples has obviously become so tantamount to them. They're going to liberate the occupied part, the occupied part of Cyprus in the north, so as to allegedly expel Turkey. Do so in conjunction with the Cypriot military and the Greek military, and in doing so, supposedly kind of secure the island for themselves. This is what the agenda is here, and this is also why the last 2 years have been reports of Cyprus being given as well Israeli defense systems, which I think were some recently confirmed as well. And I had noticed this in the initial stages around pretty much since the early days of 2024, when I found it alarming as to why Cyprus all of a sudden was accumulating or being given Israeli air defense systems. I was concerned as to what exactly is the plan that they're trying to prepare Cyprus for? What is Cyprus going to be defending itself against? Yes, there is an occupation, but the conflict is frozen, so there's a relative calm, there's a status quo. To all of a sudden be escalating air defense systems from Israel inside of Cyprus, it goes to show that there's an agenda here as well. And the agenda that they have for Cyprus is to expel Turkey in order to limit Turkey's influence within the region, because Israel wants to be the dominating influence in the region. And this fits part and parcel with the Greater Israel plan. The idea is to expand and accumulate as much territory as possible. I mean, this is how colonialism operates. They want to take vast territory. They want to control Syria. This is why they're occupying Syria at the moment. This is why they're using the Druze. They're using the conflicts that have arisen after the overthrow of Assad inside Syria in order to be able to kind of divide and conquer Syria, in order to probably balkanize Syria or take control of the vast territories of Syria, again, fitting within the Greater Israel plan. And now they're trying to do the same thing in Cyprus, and they're also trying to do the same thing in Lebanon by creating intersections or kind of fueling the intersectionalist tensions within Lebanon in order to basically justify and provide pretext to constantly sort of militarily intervene and occupy Lebanon, which they are occupying 5 key territories inside of Lebanon, and they are refusing to leave. Cyprus is now the next point of contestation, and it's going to be the Cypriot public that is going to suffer the cost, because Turkey is a strong military. This is a fact. And even though Israel itself is backed by the United States, etc., if there is going to be any sort of tension that's going to be created between Israel and Turkey, and using the Cypriot people as bait, essentially, this is going to completely destroy the island, and it's going to bring about again the tensions within the Cypriot population. And any sort of attempt to liberate the island from the north without any resolution between the two communities and the unfortunate bloody history that has taken place is going to merely generate more tensions within the public that will then justify further imperialist intervention on the island, therefore forever depleting any opportunity for this place to unify peacefully, but also to be a sovereign independent state, which is why Cypriots should be very alarmed about what's happening. But the vast majority of them, I don't think know, especially from a certain generation upwards that may not are relying on Cypriot media to relay this information to them. They are not aware of the extent of the dangers in their country.
I've seen reports, and by the way, you're quite right to point out that the size of Turkey's army is formidable. It's the second largest army in NATO by a significant margin over every other European country. I've seen reports of a considerable military buildup by the Turkish forces in the north of Cyprus, in the occupied part of Cyprus. Are those reports accurate, and do we know the extent of that buildup?
I mean, I believe those reports are rather accurate because, as I said, I haven't seen any other way to verify it. This is information as well that I've seen come out of the north in media outlets out of the north. The Cypriot media has touched on it, so therefore I believe that this is currently happening. But this is part and parcel of response to the current tensions that are happening now between Israel and Turkey. And because of Israel's, as I've said, they're constantly trying to integrate Cyprus into this greater Israel project. But to do so, you do need to expel Turkey. Turkey, however, itself has its own agenda in Cyprus. I mean, the entire reason that they have occupied the north of Cyprus is because it was part and parcel of a plan that was laid out by President Johnson from the United States in 1964. This was really, and this was a part of the idea of appeasing both Greece and Turkey at the time, which were NATO states, in order to secure the eastern frontier from the USSR. So the idea was to give the north part of Cyprus to Turkey because it's essential for its own surveillance and military security. This is why the northern part of Cyprus is so significant to Turkey as well. And they're not about to just simply allow Israel to infiltrate into the south and try to so-called liberate or cause any tensions that will threaten their own security interests in the region, which I said, it's not just happening in Cyprus. We've also seen these tensions between Turkey and Israel also take part, happening in Syria as well. And it's also going to begin happening in Lebanon because Turkey also has a vested interest for its own military, its own economic sort of ambitions within Lebanon to have significant control over the north of Lebanon, which again is something that does not appease Israel. But at the same time, I don't even think it appeases the United States in many ways because Turkey is a very big country. It has a powerful military. It is an important it's become one of the most, if not the most powerful sort of player in West Asia. And this threatens Israel, but it also threatens the United States, who wants to be the dominant party within the region for economic purposes, for, in order to be able to control resources and trade routes, etc. And having a Turkey that is at this point becoming far too powerful impedes on the interests as well of Western states. So what we're going to see, I believe, in Cyprus is that we're going to see Israel try to antagonize Turkey through Cyprus, as we're seeing in Syria as well. But I do think it will come with the backing of the United States, who also wants to placate Turkey, because there was actually a lot of, I don't know if you've become aware of this, there's been a lot of reports by these American so-called think tanks, like Atlantic Council, that are discussing the idea of we need to rein in Turkey as a NATO member. This, when you have the Atlantic Council or the RAND Corporation publishing reports, basically identifying Turkey now as a major problem, when Turkey has been an ally to the West in many ways, more ways than one, this goes to show that even the United States is starting to view Turkey as a threat, because you never want any other more powerful entity in a region that is so significant to the economic trade relations that is so fundamental to U.S. hegemony as well. So
Yeah.
This is why we're also seeing the buildup in the north happening now as well.
Yeah, when the Atlantic Council and the RAND Corporation are writing articles like that about you, you better head for the hills, because you're in serious trouble. But,
yeah, I know these think tanks, the think tanks. It's very concerning. And this was not the case. This wouldn't be the case a year ago. You wouldn't see these kind of articles coming out in mass about Turkey. But now all of a sudden, because even now recently, with the recent Trump deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and the new trade corridor, the fact that this trade corridor, this corridor, the Zangezur corridor, has been basically given to American mercenaries private companies in order to protect. And then it's Turkey is actually building the pipelines. I think it's the Trans-Anatolian pipelines between essentially Azerbaijan, Turkey, and into Europe. And it's Europe right now that's also in need of oil and gas in order to be able to sustain their own economies. So Turkey's becoming this major energy hub, from whatever angle you look at it, because it's become this sole source of energy for the West. And this is becoming a bit alarming as well. And sort of seeing how they're maneuvering in the region is something that they're going to try to stop. And they're going to use Cyprus as a form of intimidation. But as I said, it's going to be the Cypriot population and its own autonomy and its sovereignty that's going to suffer the cost of Israel's so-called attempt to liberate occupied territories which is laughable.
So, Elina, just a few kilometers from where I'm sitting is an Air Force base of the Greek military, just beside Kalamata Airport. And at that airport, at that military base, they have a training center operated by Elbit Systems, the murderous Israeli drone manufacturer. And there have been times where I have seen over my house outside of Kalamata, things that bear a striking similarity to Israeli drones, although they were not obviously bearing the marks of the Israeli military. And we know for a fact, because the Greek government has admitted it, that Greece allowed the Israeli Air Force to use Greek airspace to practice bombing runs on Iran before the Israelis launched their criminal war of aggression against the Islamic Republic. Are similar things happening in Cyprus, as far as you know? Are there actually military personnel or personnel of military industrial corporations from Israel on the ground? Are the Israelis using Cypriot airspace for military or surveillance purposes? And I'm not talking here, I want to talk to you, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to talk to you separately about Akrotiri. I just want to park that for a second. I'm talking about the sovereign territory of Cyprus, not about British military bases.
I'm actually glad you said that because there's always a lot of focus as to what the British bases are doing, but there's such little focus as to what actually the Cypriot government is allowing their their military air bases, particularly, for example, the one in Bafos, to essentially engage in. And we have actually seen reports recently, even published by Cypriot media. I think it was Cyprus Mail. I'm not quite sure, but it was Cypriot media outlets that had actually published reports that the Cypriot bases, particularly air bases in Bafos, for example, were being permitted to be used by Israeli kind of air forces in order to run practice drills as well, pretty much along the same lines of what you have just basically outlined. And even during the sort of 12-day war between Iran and Israel, they even were using the actual Larnaca International Airport. They also not only use the Larnaca International Airport in order to place the Israeli planes, commercial planes, but also there's military planes, also including American military planes that are being placed in the Larnaca International Airport. This has been pretty much verified not only by Cypriot media but by the vast majority of pretty much observers. If you were to go in Larnaca, and my house in Larnaca, for example, is very close to the airport. I'll be sitting outside my house and there's military, American and Israeli military helicopters and planes that fly straight into the Larnaca International Airport. That is, again, a major source of concern as well for the Cypriot population, because in any sort of escalation within the region, whether it's, for example, even with Hezbollah, who, if we go back to May of 2024, we'll all remember Saeed Nasrallah, who had actually stated and warned the Cypriot Republic, the Republic of Cyprus, rather, to not permit Israel to continue using its air bases and airports because they will be viewed as legitimate threats in any sort of escalation with Lebanon and with Hezbollah more broadly. So this is something that was brought to the attention of the Cypriot public then, and then we've now seen multiple reports coming out that yes, there are Cypriot territories, both military air bases, but also our international airports that are being used to house and provide sort of even practice drills for the Israeli military, as well as, of course, the contract, the kind of agreement that was made in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, between Israel and the Cypriot Republic in order to practice military drills together, where they use the Cypriot planes, which are similar to that of Lebanon, in order to kind of practice possible war simulation, and scenarios that they would encounter if they were to invade Lebanon. So there is this kind of integration between the the Cypriot military, its bases, and even its international airports with that of Israel, that it places a direct threat on the Republic of Cyprus that is completely separate to that of the British bases. And this gets very, very little attention. But Cyprus itself is a big part of that. And I'll just say this as well very quickly, is that during the initial, before the kind of war Lebanon had begun, throughout the summer period of 2024, there was even articles that were published by Israeli media, as well as obviously independent media like The Cradle, that had actually reported that there was an agreement made that between Israel as well as Jordan, Cyprus, and Greece, that they would basically be serving as defense platforms for Israel in case of a war with Hezbollah, but also with Iran. So instantly, Cyprus would be used as a medium by which to defend Israel. Therefore, bringing it directly, and this is the Republic of Cyprus, not the bases. This would bring Cyprus directly into the front lines, I guess, of a greater war in the region.
So let's talk then about Akrotiri. Again, in the course of reporting from Cyprus about the genocide and Cyprus's role in this, I learned so much that I didn't know and should have known, frankly. One of the things that I didn't know was that the Akrotiri Peninsula is actually, as a legal matter, the sovereign territory of Britain. This is not land that is being leased from the Cypriot state by Britain. They actually own the land, and presumably their laws would view their laws as applying there. But in any event, we dared to step onto the sovereign territory of Britain when we were on the island, and we recorded numerous flights of massive military cargo planes taking off from the British military base there and flying off in the direction of the genocidal entity. And recently, Sir Keir Starmer is coming under increasing pressure about Britain's support for Israel, because people all across the world can see Palestinian children are literally starving to death as a result of these genocidal policies. And so my question to you is, within the past couple of months, as far as you can tell, people on the island, analysts, activists, has there been a meaningful reduction in supportive efforts from the Akrotiri military base for Israel, or does it appear to be business as usual?
Business as usual, based on the trackings that we have seen, and based on reports as well that we have seen from, especially, I think it's the British journalist, Matt Kennard. He seems to be very on top of kind of constantly tracking everything that comes out of the British base, which is like, it's I think every British journalist has a obligation to observe what is happening in the British bases, because it's their, like you said, it's sovereign territory of the UK. They're British enclaves. They don't belong. They're not part and parcel of the Cypriot Republic. So if they are participating in what is a genocide against the Palestinian people, of which just yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, the United Nations even declared officially a famine now in Gaza, and how their government is participating in that. Every British journalist should actually be participating in this. And from a lot of the sort of the activity that I've seen myself personally from the British bases, it has been business as usual, and there hasn't been in any way an attempt to reduce that. Even officially, the British state has not come out and said that they're going to actually reduce their assistance at this point in time with Israel. Even with regards to the trade agreements that they have with the UK, so between the UK and the Zionist entity, they said they're still continuing the ongoing trade, but they've apparently halted the prospects in order to extend the trade or for the new trade agreement that was to follow. But nothing actually that's going to change the present situation. So the ongoing activity that's happening in the Rafah Akrotiri bases is pretty much ongoing. And it's not even just the fact that the British bases are constantly being used in order to kind of take cargo ships. But the British bases have also been used to bomb Yemen by the United States and by the British during that joint operation against Yemen. But the other issue is that it's also being used to carry in surveillance. This is carry out surveillance operations on top of Gaza, which means, therefore, basically taking information that is going to be used by the Israeli military to target, for example, Palestinians, to target supposedly, Hamas fighters, et cetera, even though there's been a recent report by Plus 927 that has basically found that only 8,900, Hamas and PIG fighters have been killed, with 82% of the casualties being civilians. So just going to show like this sort of blatant disregard anyway that Israel has. But there's a lot of surveillance operations that are happening in within the Rafah Akrotiri bases. But as well, it's not just as well Israel. We also are, I think there was a nice report that was published at some point by Declassified UK that found that there's a lot of American operations that are happening in Rafah Akrotiri that are not being disclosed to the Cypriot public. And also some of the more advanced military intelligence operations of the British, which are obviously functioning in the north, but like I said, in the Rafah Qudsi, but even the Americans. So we don't even know how much personnel the Americans have, or how many Israelis might even be present in Rafah Qudsi. So it's pretty much a sort of like this veil of a mystery in many ways that we're constantly trying to unravel, but nothing in that territory has stopped taking place that hasn't been taking place already since October 23.
Now, as far as I can tell, whenever the Cypriot government has responded to complaints about this from Palestinian solidarity groups and international legal experts, to the extent it responds at all, it essentially says, well, that's British sovereign territory. What can we do about it? What is your response to that? Is there something that, in your opinion, the Cypriot government can do consistently with its legal obligations to put a stop to this nonsense?
Yes, it absolutely can. So first of all, if you start to look at even when you look at the establishment of the Constitution of Cyprus and the agreements to begin with, actually provided these enclaves, because for perspective, the only reason the British have 4% of Cypriot territory that has been handed over to them was fundamentally because it was a condition in order to provide Cypriots with their independence. So when this exchange essentially happened, when Cypriot had gained their independence, the idea was that the British will obviously keep these bases. However, there is a particular section within this agreement that dictates that the territory cannot be used in any way that shall threaten the native Cypriot population directly or indirectly, because the Cypriots, our human rights essentially have to be respected at all times, and the enclave should in no way act in a way that will violate that. So the fact that the British territories are, for example, participating in operations, or have been used to participate in operations against Iran, or even committing genocide, or targeting Yemen, for instance. This actively places the British enclaves as a direct kind of belligerent actor that would be a legitimate military target. But the military target won't just be the enclaves. This will drag in the entirety of Cyprus. Periphery areas will be targeted, which means now this has to do with the Republic of Cyprus and the safety of its own citizens. And therefore, the Republic of Cyprus has an obligation by law to secure the human rights and the protection of its own citizens, and to make certain that the enclaves that are being used by the British are in no way threatening the sovereignty, first of all, of Cyprus, which right now is being directly threatened because as well of the way the British bases are being used, but also the Cypriot population. And in doing so, this could actually challenge the even existence of the British bases, because, like I said, if it's viewed in any way to direct the sovereignty of the Cypriot Republic, but also the human rights and basic protections of its civilian population, then there could be a direct legal claim to be made with regards to kind of, reviewing whether the British bases should still even be allowed to exist. However, of course, the Cypriot Republic isn't going to say a good very deal, and they're going to hide behind the mirage of, oh, well, it's British sovereign territory, there's nothing we can do, because it's easier, rather than having to actually, first of all, have to take the legal action and deal with the British, because then you have to be dealing with the Americans and the Israelis, which are powerful forces. But then also, on the other hand, the Cypriot Republic itself is providing its own airports, its own commercial airports, and also its own military air bases to Israel, to the United States, in order to be practicing the same sort of operations that we're seeing anyway in Rafah Qudsi. So you would have to then there would be quite a hypocritical stance. So it just goes to show that the Cypriot state under Nikos Christodoulidis is pretty much a complete subservient of the US, the British, and Israel.
And that brings me to my next question. Why? Why has the Cypriot government of Christodoulidis adopted such a pro-Israel policy? Is it simply a question of compulsion? He has no other practical choice because greater powers are imposing this upon Cyprus, or has his government convinced itself that there's actually some benefit, some long-term benefit to the Cypriot people from close cooperation with a genocidal entity?
Oh, There's a lot of things to answer. There's quite a lot of things to say here. So first of all, I will say that when you look at Nikos Christodoulidis' history, the party that he represents and the politics that he has, I mean, Cyprus has its own history and battles with imperialism, its own history and battles with British Empire, and how that has obviously impacted the island. And Nikos Christodoulidis is part and parcel of this, of this very, of this. I mean, even when he had come into presidency, he had, he does actually have rather more on the right wing tendencies and ideology. He actually had, for those that don't know, he had part of his campaign included Enosis, which was written right behind him when he won the presidential campaign. And that is an idea in itself that is highly problematic in Cyprus. And Enosis, for those that don't know, was like union of Cyprus with Greece, which is now an outdated concept, but was something that he was obviously still advocating for. And the reason I bring this up is because the idea of Enosis in many ways as well was kind of propagated and pushed as well by British colonial empire and rule in order to divide and rule the Cypriot population so as to be able to infiltrate and maintain control over the island, which we're still seeing today because of the conflicts that this kind of issue has created, because of the fact that Cypriots have not been allowed to harmonize as a society. And like I said, this was part of the parcel of pushing forward this idea. And when we start thinking as well of the coup that happened in Cyprus, pro-Enosis, et cetera, that was backed by the CIA, that was backed by the West. So a lot of these individuals that harbor these ideas have, it's an idea that is pretty much linked as well to the West. It's linked to the United States. It's linked to imperialism. And a lot of them have received lucrative funding. A lot of the leaders of these movements were even directly connected and financially supported, whether it was directly or indirectly, for example, through the United States. So Nikos Christodoulidis and the party that he represents has always been very pro the US. He has always been very pro the West. And because it has been very much part and parcel of the ideology of the party as a whole. So it's really no coincidence that we're seeing Nikos Christodoulidis take this stance. But in addition to that, he's also an opportunist himself. And the way that this is sort of being phrased in Cyprus is kind of, Israelis are pretty much providing, investment capital into Cyprus. This is going to only enrich the island in the same way, for example, that we saw Russians obviously invest capital in Cyprus. So why should they be treated any differently? But there is a crucial difference. Russian investment in Cyprus is it's purely done for the purpose of, it could be like money, maybe even money laundering. It might be, just tax evasion, because Cyprus is a tax haven. This is a reality that I think is well known. And this attracts a lot of capital from all over the world. This is how Cyprus is being used. This is how Cyprus has accumulated a big chunk of its wealth. But the difference with Israel is that it obviously has an ongoing agenda of establishing exclusive zones and territories and excluding the local population and pretty much politically as well as economically taking over the entire island for its own use. So there's a difference between direct investment for your own purposes, right? For example, anybody else, you have what it's called, capitalist nomads and et cetera. All these people that try to take advantage of the tax havens here as they would anywhere else. That's one thing. But the gradual takeover through land, through real estate agencies and territories as a whole, and creating these exclusive regions, as Stefanos Stefanou has said, is an entire different sort of different type of investment, which resembles actually in many ways what the Zionists had done to Palestine. This was the initial incremental sort of invasion of Palestine, was way before 1948. It happened through these sort of gradual takeovers and the purchasing of large chunks of territory within Palestine and the repopulation of Palestine gradually. Again, this was before 1948. So this is being phrased in Cyprus as, this is just investment. This is kind of an opportunity for Cyprus. And then the third problem that I think that Cypriots are going, that is happening in Cyprus, is the way that some people, I wouldn't say that Nikos Christodoulidis is explicitly stating something along these lines, but a narrative that I have heard, and this is what's most problematic, is that as a result of the internal frustrations and conflicts and the bloody history of Cyprus that was, it's drenched in divide and rule, there is a chunk of Cypriot population that have this ideology of, well, we would rather prefer the Israelis rather than the Turks. And so this is what I mean. This is where imperialism has been successful in Cyprus. It has successfully infiltrated the minds of the Cypriot population to a degree that they are unaware of their own history. They're completely indoctrinated to understand what has actually happened on this island. And because of that, they lend themselves over to these greater imperialist plans by the sheer fact that there is this internal sort of hatred that has developed as a result of external factors and what has happened on the island, that it allows for foreign powers to be able to infiltrate them. And we're seeing that happen now with Israel, with this logic of, well, we'll rather an Israeli than a Turk. The Israeli hasn't harmed me. They're bringing money into the country. So it's this very narrow, very, historically inaccurate interpretation of history, a lack of imperialist understanding of what's happened on this island. And Nikos Christodoulidis lends himself over to that particular ideology, which also creates a problem among Cypriots in terms of understanding what is actually happening. But like I said, this is how imperialism can be rather successful.
Yeah, I can say from my time here in Greece that there is a significant portion of the population. I believe it's a minority, but it's not a small minority. Believe that Greece's alliance, extraordinarily close alliance with Israel's genocidal regime, somehow protects us against Turkish aggression. And all I can say in response to that is, if you do a deal with the devil, you're going to get burnt. That's all there is to it.
I agree.
So, on that note, I would like to conclude our conversation today. You've been very gracious with your time, and I really hope, Elina, that we can continue this conversation in the future. Of course, I would 100% agree. And I just want to say one small thing, like about Nikos Christodoulidis, and for any particular Cypriot who says that they would rather prefer Israel, any sort of alliance as well for Cyprus with Israel is fundamentally problematic when you're trying to appeal to the international community about the occupation of your land, when you're trying to claim that you're looking for one state solution to unify the Cypriot people, aligning yourself with the most genocidal occupational entity that exists, completely deters and tarnishes your argument and appeal to the international community to therefore look and bring justice to your own state of occupation. And I think that's something that I really want to highlight, because I think, there are certain segments within Cypriot society that do forget that. And that was kind of something that I just wanted to throw out there last minute. That's an incredibly important and powerful point, and I'm really glad you made it. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. So with that, we'll call it a day. And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on August 25th, 2025.